Welcome to The Explainer. You know, if you've ever found yourself wondering exactly how spices literally came to rule the ancient world, well, you are in the exact right place. Today, we're jumping straight back in time to uncover an ancient, absolute maritime superpower that pretty much shaped the entire fabric of global trade. We are talking about the rise of the Chera dynasty.
To really set the scene, we have to look at what was happening across the subcontinent. Up in North India, things were brutal. For nearly 200 years, it was just consumed by this fierce tripartite struggle. You had the Palas, the Rashtrakutas, and the Garjara Pratiharas, endlessly spilling blood just to control Kannauj. But while the North was completely locked in these grinding land wars, a totally different, unbelievably wealthy world was being built down in the South. Mighty kingdoms, specifically the Cheras, the Cholas, and the Pandyas, were rapidly rising up and forging a legacy that would change everything.
So, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll kick things off with Beyond the North. Then we'll get into the kings of the Chera dynasty, explore their massive ocean trade empire, dive into culture and Sangam literature, and finally wrap up with their decline and lasting legacy.
All right, Part 1, Beyond the North.
The Cheras emerged from an ancient region known as Tamilakam. Picture this: incredibly lush, thickly forested terrain covering what we now know as modern-day Kerala, western Tamil Nadu, and parts of Karnataka. Following the decline of the Mauryan Empire, these Dravidian rulers stepped up. They established their kingdom right in the safety of the Western Ghats, which, if you think about it, was just the absolute perfect strategic cradle for an emerging empire.
Moving right along to Part 2, Kings of the Chera dynasty.
Let's look at the timeline here. The Cheras actually first pop up on the radar around the 3rd century BCE, but their real, undeniable power solidified in the 1st century CE. That's when a ruler named Utian Cheralatan managed to unite them into a single, cohesive force. After him came the warlike Nedan Cheralatan, who rapidly expanded their borders. And that perfectly set the stage for the 2nd century CE, when a king named Senkutuan elevated the entire empire to its absolute zenith.
And these guys had a seriously distinct identity. Imagine a vibrant, bright red flag snapping in the wind, sporting their official royal emblem, the bow and arrow. Ruling over those thick forests we talked about, they proudly took on the title Lords of the Forests and Mountains. And when it came to warfare, they didn't hold back. They unleashed the sheer terror of massive, thundering war elephants. It must have been an unbelievable sight. Now, you really can't talk about the Cheras without talking about Senkutuvan. He's widely remembered as the absolute greatest ruler in their history. Known as the Red Chera, his legendary status is actually immortalized in the great Tamil epic, the Silappatikaram. He was a military powerhouse who launched massive expeditions as far north as the Ganga River. But he wasn't just a warlord. He was equally devoted to culture, famously building the great temple of goddess Kannagi, which permanently cemented her story in Tamil history. Which brings us to Part 3, the Ocean Trade Empire. Okay, here is the real secret to their unbelievable wealth. It wasn't actually the land at all. It was the wind. Specifically, the Hippolytus wind. Named after a famous Greek navigator, this was a highly predictable, incredibly powerful monsoon wind. And it was a total game changer. This wind allowed enormous merchant ships from Rome, Greece, and Arabia to just bypass the slow coastal routes and sail directly across the Arabian Sea, right into Chera ports. Because the Cheras had a firm grip over these specific coastal entry points, they transformed South India into the beating heart of the global economy.
The sheer scale of this commerce is just staggering. From Rome and Arabia, the Cheras were importing literal fortunes. Solid gold and silver coins, really fine wines, and magnificent horses. In return, they exported the treasures of the earth. We're talking black pepper, cardamom, cinnamon, pearls, and ivory. I mean, just imagine standing on those docks. The heavy, sharp scent of exotic spices, literally trading hands for the gleaming shine of solid Roman gold.
And the absolute crown jewel of this entire network was the port of Muziris, which is modern-day Kodungallur. It essentially became the richest and most important port of its time. The Chera rulers actually had to station naval forces directly at the port just to guard the staggering amount of wealth flowing through it. In fact, to the Romans trading there, South Indian black pepper was valued even more highly than gold itself. Think about that for a second.
But, of course, with great wealth comes intense rivalry.
For centuries, the South was defined by this continuous tripartite struggle between the Cheras, the Cholas, and the Pandyas. It was basically a giant geopolitical chess match. Alliances were shifting constantly. One decade, the Cheras and Pandyas might unite against the Cholas. The next, the tables completely turn. It was an endless, tense cycle defined by fierce naval clashes out on the water and those thundering elephant charges on land.
Let's jump into Part 4, Culture and Sangam Literature.
So you might be wondering, how do we actually know all of these rich details today? Well, virtually everything we know about the Cheras comes from an extraordinary body of work called Sangam literature. These ancient Tamil poetic texts are literally our greatest historical window into this era. The poets of the time wrote about everything: the kings, their war strategies, the sprawling trade networks, and everyday society. Because the rulers had such deep respect for these scholars, Tamil literature still considers this period an absolute golden age.
And I have to mention, the Chera kings were ridiculously generous patrons of culture, art, and dance. When poets stood in the royal courts and recited these epic verses of bravery, the kings didn't just give them a polite round of applause. No way. They rewarded these scholars with solid gold, massive land grants, and sometimes literally live war elephants. It really shows you exactly where their cultural priorities lay.
Finally, Part 5, Decline and Lasting Legacy. By the time we hit the 11th and 12th centuries, the political map was shifting drastically. The Cheras found themselves completely surrounded. The overwhelming naval power of the Cholas was squeezing their trade routes on the seas, while the sheer land power of the Pandyas was pressing hard on their borders. Repeated wars and seized ports just slowly, continuously drained their strength. Until finally, around the 12th century, the centralized political entity of the Cheras fractured apart into much smaller local chiefdoms. There's a historical summary that I think just perfectly captures their twilight. It goes, "The Chera dynasty did not end with the sword, but with the passage of time. There was no single dramatic, apocalyptic final battle that wiped them out. Instead, global trade routes slowly shifted, rivals eventually took control of the seas, and their economic engine weakened. Changing circumstances simply pushed their political dominance into the pages of history."
Yet despite fading from power, their legacy is absolutely undeniable. I mean, they pioneered global maritime connections, linking India to Rome, Arabia, and eventually even China. They preserved early South Indian history for us through their fierce patronage of Sangam poetry. They catalyzed the Bhakti movement with rulers like Kulasekara Alvar. And ultimately, they forged the foundational cultural and religious identity of modern-day Kerala.
Which really leaves us with a fascinating thought. If their legacy is still living and breathing in the cultural fabric of modern Kerala, and if the ancient global trade routes they pioneered basically laid the groundwork for the modern global economy, did the Chera Empire ever truly fall? Or did it just evolve into the world we know today? Thank you so much for joining me to explore this incredible slice of history. Keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.